Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit that is certain of itself. Conscience. I must get one. The beautiful soul, evil, and its forgiveness. And I think what Hegel says about forgiveness is very beautiful and powerful. So, pay attention. The antinomy of the moral view of the world, namely that there is a moral consciousness, that should say a moral consciousness, not a moral consciousness, a moral consciousness, and that there is none, or that the validation of duty lies beyond consciousness, and conversely, takes place in it. These contradictions were gathered up in the idea in which the non-moral consciousness has more validity. Its contingent knowing and willing are assumed to have full weight, and happiness is granted to it as an act of grace. Moral self-consciousness did not accept responsibility for this self-contradictory idea, but shifted it onto a being other than itself. By this placing outside of itself what it must think of as necessary is as much a contradiction as regards form, as the other was as regards content. Because, however, what appears as contradictory propositions, which the moral consciousness makes clumsy efforts first to separate, and then to reconcile, are intrinsically the same, since pure duty, namely as pure knowing, is nothing else than the self of consciousness, and the self of consciousness is being and actuality. And similarly, because what is supposed to lie beyond actual consciousness is nothing else than pure thought, and thus is in fact the self. Because this is so, self-consciousness for us, or in itself, retreats into itself and is aware that that being is its own self, in which what is actual is at the same time pure knowing and pure duty. It is itself in its contingency completely valid in its own sight, and knows its immediate individuality to be pure knowing and doing to be the true reality and harmony. This self of conscience, spirit, that is directly aware of itself as absolute truth and being, is the third self. We have reached it as the outcome of the third world of spirit, and we shall briefly compare it with the two preceding selves. The totality or actuality which shows itself to be the truth of the ethical world is the self of the legal process, of the legal person. Its existence, it consists in its being acknowledged by others. Just as this person is the self that is devoid of substance, so is its existence an abstract reality too. The person counts, and that simply as a person. The self is the point immediately at rest in the element of its being. The point is not separated off from its universality, and therefore the two are not actively related to one another. The universal is in it without any distinction, and is neither the content of the self, nor is the self filled by itself. The second self is the world of culture, which has attained its truth, or it is spirit that has recovered itself from its dividedness, absolute freedom. In this self, that first immediate unity of individual and universality is sundered. The universal, which all the same remains a purely spiritual entity, the state of being acknowledged or universal willing to and knowing, is object and content of the self and is universal reality. But it does not have the form of an existence, free from the self. In this self, therefore, it obtains no filling and no positive content, no world. Moral self-consciousness does indeed let its universality go free, so that it becomes a nature of its own, and equally it holds fast to it within itself as a superseded moment. It is, however, merely an insincere play of alternating these two determinations. It is as conscience that it first has in itself certainly a content for the previously empty duty, and also for the right and the universal will that were empty of content. And because this self-assurance is at the same time an immediacy, conscience exists. Moral self-consciousness, having attained its truth, it therefore abandons or rather supersedes the internal division which gave rise to the dissemblance, the division between the inner self and the self, between pure duty qua person, qua purpose, and reality qua nature and sense opposed to pure purpose. It is when thus returned into itself, concrete moral spirit which in the consciousness of pure duty does not give itself an empty criterion to be used against actual consciousness. On the contrary, pure duty, as also the nature opposed to it, are superseded moments. Spirit is in an immediate unity a self-actualizing being, and the action is immediately something concretely moral. Suppose a case of moral action. It is an objective reality for the knowing consciousness. This qua consciousness knows it in an immediate concrete manner, and at the same time it is only as conscious knows it. Knowing is contingent in it so far as it is something other than the object, but spirit that is self-certain is no longer such a contingent knower, and a producer of thoughts divorced from reality. On the contrary, since the separation of the in itself and the self has been done away with, a case of moral action is, in the sense certainty of knowing, directly as it is in itself, and it is in itself only in the way that it is in this kind of knowing. Action qua actualization is thus the pure form of will, the simple conversion of a reality that merely is into a reality that results from action. The conversion of the bare mode of objective knowing, i.e. knowing an object, into one of knowing reality as something produced by consciousness, just as sense certainty is immediately taken up or rather converted into the in itself of spirit, so this conversion too is simple and unmediated, a transition effected by the pure notion without alteration of the content being determined by the interest of the consciousness knowing it. Further, conscience does not split up the circumstances of the case into a variety of duties. It does not behave as a positive universal medium, wherein the many duties would acquire each for itself a fixed substantial nature. If it did, then, either no action could take place at all, because each concrete case involves an antithesis in general, and in the case of morality, a clash of duties, and therefore, by the very nature of action, one side would be injured, one duty violated, or else. If action did take place, there would be an actual violation of one of the conflicting duties. Conscience is rather the negative one, or absolute self, which does away with these various moral substances. It is simple action in accordance with duty, which fulfills not this or that duty, but knows and does what is concretely right. It is therefore first of all moral action qua action, into which the previous moral consciousness that did not act has passed. The concrete shape of the deed may be analysed by the consciousness looking for distinctions into various properties, that is, here into various moral relations, and each of these may either be asserted as absolutely valid, as it must be if it is supposed to be duty, or else compared and tested. In the simple moral action of conscience, duties are lumped together in such a way that all these single entities are straightway demolished, and the sifting of them into the steadfast certainty of conscience to ascertain what our duty is simply does not take place. Flower apart. Sometimes classed as a symbolist painter, I suppose she could be. Very nice. Just as little is there present in conscience that fluctuating uncertainty of consciousness, which now places so-called pure morality outside of itself into another holy being and takes itself to be unholy, but then again places so-called pure morality within itself and the connection of the sensuous with the moral in that other being. It renounces all these attitudes and dissemblances connected with the moral view of the world when it renounces that consciousness which thinks of duty and reality as contradictory, and under this latter view I act morally when I am conscious of performing only pure duty and nothing else but that. This means, in fact, when I do not act, but when I really act, I am conscious of another, of a reality which is already in existence and of a reality which I wish to produce. I have a specific purpose and fulfill a specific duty, in which there is something else than the pure duty which alone should be intended. Conscience, on the other hand, is awareness of the fact that when the moral consciousness declares pure duty to be the essence of its action, this pure purpose is a dissemblance of the truth of the matter. For the fact is that pure duty consists in the empty abstraction of pure thought, and has its reality and its content only in a specific reality, in a reality which is the reality of consciousness itself, and consciousness not as a mere thought thing, but as an individual. As for conscience itself, this knows that it has its truth in the immediate certainty of itself. This immediate concrete self-certainty is the essence of the action. Looking at this certainty from the point of view of the antithesis of consciousness, the content of the moral action is the doer's own immediate individuality, and the form of that content is just his self as a pure movement, namely as the individual's knowing or his own conviction. Looking more closely at the unity of the moral consciousness and at the significance of its moments, we see that it regards itself as the inner self or essence, but as conscience it apprehends its being for self or itself. The contradiction of the moral consciousness resolves itself, i.e. the difference which lies at its base proves to be none, and it runs away into pure negativity. But this precisely is the self, a simple self which is both a pure knowing and a knowledge of itself as this individual consciousness. Consequently, this self constitutes the content of what was previously the empty essence, for it is actual a self which no longer has the significance of being a nature alien to the essence, and with laws of its own, independent of it, as the negative. It is, difference. It is the difference within the pure essence, a content, and one to. I must have been drunk when I typed this bit out. It is the difference within pure essence, a content, and one to, which is valid in and for itself. Further, this self, qua a pure self-identical knowing, is the absolute universal, so that just this knowing as its own knowing, as conviction, is duty. Duty is no longer the universal that stands over against the self. On the contrary, it is known to have no validity. When thus separated, it is now the law that exists for the sake of the self, not the self that exists for the sake of the law. Law and duty, however, have for that reason the significance not only of being for self, but also of intrinsic being. For this knowing, because it is self-identical, is precisely the in itself. In consciousness too, this in itself separates itself from that immediate unity with being for self, as though standing over against the latter. It is being a being for another. A duty itself, as duty forsaken by the self, is now known to be only a moment. From signifying the absolute essence, it has fallen to the level of mere being, but which is not self, and not for itself, and is therefore a being for another. But the being for another remains an essential moment, just because the self, qua consciousness, constitutes the antithesis of being for self and being for another. And now duty is present to consciousness as something directly actual, is no longer merely abstract pure consciousness. This being for another is therefore the substance which remains in itself or unexplicated, which is distinct from the self. Conscience has not given up pure duty or the abstract in itself. A duty is the essential moment of relating itself qua universality to another conscience. Conscience is the common element of the two self-consciousnesses, and this element is the substance in which the deed has an enduring reality, the moment of being recognized and acknowledged by others. The moral consciousness does not possess this moment of recognition by others, or pure consciousness, which has a real existence and consequently does not act or actualize anything at all. It is in itself. It's in itself is. For it either abstract, unreal essence or being as a reality which is not spiritual. The existent reality of conscience, however, is one which is a self and existence which is conscious of itself. The spiritual element of being recognized and acknowledged. The action is thus only the translation of its individual content into the objective element in which it is universal and recognized. And it is just the fact that it is recognized that makes the deed a reality. The deed is recognized and thereby made real because the existing reality is directly linked with conviction or knowledge of, in other words, knowing one's purpose is directly the element of existence, is universal recognition. For the essence of the action and duty consists in conscience, consciousness conviction about it. It is just this conviction that is the inner self, It is the implicitly universal self-consciousness, or the state of being recognised and hence a reality. What is done with the conviction of duty is therefore at once something that has standing and a real existence. There is then no more talk of good intentions coming to nothing, or of the good man faring badly. On the contrary, the duty that is known to be such is fulfilled and becomes a reality, just because what is essentially a duty is the universal for all self-consciousness, is that which is recognised and acknowledged and thus positively is. But, taken separately and alone, without the content of self, a duty is a being for another, something transparent which has merely the significance of an essentiality in general, lacking all content. If we look back on the sphere where spiritual reality first made its appearance, we find that the notion involved was that the utterance of individuality is that which is both in and for itself, but the shape which immediately expressed this notion was the honest consciousness which busied itself with the abstract thing itself, Sache selbst. This thing itself was there a predicate, but it is in conscience that it is for the first time a subject which has made explicit all the moments of consciousness within it, and for which all these moments, substantiality in general, external existence, and the essential nature of thought, are contained in the certainty of itself. The thing itself, I should say, has substantiality in general in the ethical sphere. External existence in culture, the self-knowing essentiality of thought and morality, and in conscience, it is the subject that knows these moments within it. While the honest consciousness always seizes merely the empty thing itself, conscience, on the other hand, wins the thing in its fullness, a fullness given to it by conscience itself. Conscience is this power because it knows the moments of consciousness as moments, dominating them as their negative essence. When conscience is considered in relation to the single determination of the antithesis, manifest in action and its awareness of the nature of those determinations, its relation to the actual case in which it has to act is in the first instance that of knower. Insofar as this knowledge has in it the moment of universality, conscientious action requires that the actual case before it should be viewed unrestrictedly in all its bearings, and therefore that all the circumstances of the case should be accurately known and taken into consideration. But this knowing, since it knows the universality as a moment, is at the same time aware that it does not know all the circumstances, or in other words, that it does not act conscientiously. The generally universal and pure relation of knowing would be a relation to something not containing an antithesis, a relation to itself, but action in virtue of the antithesis it essentially contains is related to a negative of consciousness, to a reality possessing intrinsic being, contrasted with the simplicity of pure consciousness, with the absolute other or implicit manifoldness. This reality is a plurality of circumstances which breaks up and spreads out endlessly in all directions, backwards into their conditions, sideways into their connections, forwards into their consequences. The conscientious mind is aware of this nature of the thing and of its relations to it, and knows that in the case in which it acts, it does not possess that full acquaintance with all the attendant circumstances which is required, and that its pretense of conscientiously weighing all the circumstances is vain. However, this acquaintance with and weighing of all the circumstances are not altogether lacking, but they exist only as a moment, as something which is only for others, and this incomplete knowledge is held by the conscientious mind to be sufficient and complete because it is its own knowledge. Similarly, with the universality of the essence, that is, with the determination of the content by pure consciousness, conscience then, when it proceeds to action, enters into relation with the many aspects of the case. The case breaks up into its various separate parts, and so too does the relation of pure consciousness to it, with the result that the manifold nature of the case becomes a multiplicity of duties. Conscience knows that it has to choose between them and to make a decision. For none of them in its specific character or in its content is absolute, only pure duty is that. But this abstraction of pure duty has attained in its reality the significance of the self-conscious I. The self-certain spirit rests qua conscience within itself, and its real universality or its duty lies in its pure conviction of duty. This pure conviction is, as such, as empty as pure duty. It is pure in the sense that there is nothing in it, no specific content that is a duty. But action is called for, something must be determined by the individual, and the self-certain spirit, in which the in itself has attained the significance of the self-conscious I, knows that it has the determination and content in the immediate certainty of itself. This, as the determination of content, is the natural consciousness, i.e., impulses and inclinations. Conscience does not recognize the absoluteness of any content, for it is the absolute negativity of everything determinate. It determines from its own self, but the sphere of the self into which it falls, in which falls the determinateness, as such, is the so-called sense nature. To have a content taken from the immediate certainty of itself means that it has nothing to draw on but sense nature. Everything that in previous forms of experience presented itself as good or bad, as law and right, is something other than the immediate certainty of self. It is a universal which is now a being for another. Or, looked at from another aspect, it is an object which, while mediating consciousness with itself, comes between consciousness and its own truth, so that instead of the object being the immediacy of consciousness, it rather cuts consciousness off from itself. For conscience, however, self-certainty is the pure immediate truth, and this truth is thus its immediate certainty of self, conceived as content. That is, the truth is in general the caprice of the individual and the contingency of his unconscious natural being, his sense nature. This content at the same time counts as a moral essentiality or as duty, for pure duty, as was found when testing laws, is utterly different to any content and tolerates any content. Here it has at the same time the essential form of being for self, and this form of individual conviction is nothing else but consciousness of the emptiness of pure duty and the fact that pure duty is only a moment, that its substantiality is a predicate which has its subject in the individual, whose caprice gives it its content and can associate every content with this form and attach its conscientiousness to the content. An individual increases his property in a certain way. It is everyone's duty to provide for the support of himself and his family, and no less to have a regard to the possibility of being useful to his fellow men, and of doing good to those in need. The individual is aware that this is a duty. For this content is directly contained in his certainty of himself. Furthermore, he perceives that he fulfills this duty in this particular case. Others perhaps holds this specific way of behaving to be humbug. They hold to other aspects of the concrete case. He, however, holds firmly to this aspect because he is conscious of the increase of property as pure duty. Thus, what others call violence and wrongdoing is the fulfilment of the individual's duty to maintain his independence in face of others. What they call cowardice is the duty of supporting life and the possibility of being useful to others. But what they call courage violates both duties. But cowardice cannot be so inept as not to know that the preservation of life and the possibility of being useful to others are duties, so inept as not to be convinced of the moral obligatoriness of its nature, of its action, and not to know that this obligatoriness consists in knowing it to be such. Otherwise, it would be guilty of ineptitude, of being immoral, since morality lies in the consciousness of having fulfilled one's duty. This will not be lacking when the action is called cowardice any more than when it is called courage. The abstraction called duty, being capable of any content, is also capable of cowardice. The doer, then, knows what he does to be a duty, and since he knows this, and the conviction of duty is the very essence of moral obligation, he is thus recognized and acknowledged by others. The action is thereby validated and has an actual existence. It is of no use to object to his freedom, which places any and every kind of content in the universal passive medium of duty and knowing, by maintaining that another content ought to have been placed in it. For whatever content it be, it contains the blemish of determinateness, from which pure knowing is free, determinateness which pure knowing can disdainfully reject, or equally can accept. Every content, because it is determinate, stands on the same level as any other, even if it does seem to be characterized by the elimination in it of the element of particularity. It may seem that, since in the actual case, duty in general is sundered into an antithesis, and thereby into the antithesis of individuality and universality, The duty whose content is the universal itself directly contains the nature of pure duty, and form and content are thus completely in accord. It might seem then that action for the general good is to be preferred to action for the good of the individual, but this universal duty is simply what already exists as absolute substance, as law and right, and is valid on its own account, independently of the individual's knowledge and conviction, not to mention his own immediate interest. It is therefore precisely against the form of that duty that morality in general is directed, but as regards its content, that too is a determinate content, insofar as the general good is opposed to the good of the individual. Consequently, its law is one from which conscience knows itself to be absolutely free, and it gives itself the authority to add to and take from, to neglect as well as fulfill it. Then again, the above distinction between duty to the individual and duty to the universal is in accordance with the nature of the antithesis, as such not something definitely fixed. The truth is rather that what the individual does for himself also contributes to the general good. The more he has made provision for himself, not only is there a greater possibility of his being of service to others, but his actual existence itself consists only in his being and living in contact with others. His individual enjoyment essentially has the meaning of putting what is his own at the disposal of others, and of helping them to obtain their enjoyment. Therefore, in the fulfilment of duty to individuals, and so to oneself, the duty to the universal is also fulfilled. Any weighing and comparing of duties which might be made here would be tantamount to calculating the advantage accruing to the universal from an action. But firstly, the result would be that morality would be made dependent on the necessary contingency of insight, and secondly, it is precisely the essence of conscience to have no truck with this calculating and weighing of duties, and to make its own decision without reference to any such reasons. Clara again. My advice on the subject of conscience. If I may do a Jordan Peterson thing, giving advice to men. Conscience. You need a good woman in your life. They act as a perfect conscience for you. It worked for me anyway. I'm a much better person for having a good woman in my life. Yes. In this way, then, conscience acts and preserves itself in the unity of its essential and actual being, in the unity of pure thought and individuality. It is the self-assured spirit which has its truth within itself, in its knowledge, and therein as knowledge of duty. It maintains itself therein by the very fact that what is positive in the action, the content as well as the form of the duty, and the knowledge of it belongs to the self and to the certainty of itself, but what seeks to confront the self with an essential being of its own is held to be something not true, something stripped of itself, subsistence, and only a moment. Consequently, what counts is not simply knowing in general, but conscience's knowledge of the circumstances. It places in duty as the universal in itselfness, the content which it takes from its natural individuality. For the content is one that is present within itself. The content in view of the universal medium in which it exists becomes a duty which it carries out, an empty, pure duty. Just through this action becomes established as something not self-subsistent, as only a moment. This content is the cancelled emptiness of the pure duty, or its fulfilment, but even so, conscience is free from any content whatever. It absolves itself from any specific duty which is supposed to have the validity of law. In the strength of its own self-assurance, it possesses the majesty of absolute autarky, to bind and to lose. This self-determination is therefore, without more ado, absolutely in conformity with duty. Duty is the knowing itself. The simple selfhood, however, is the inner self, for the inner self is pure self-identity, and this is in this consciousness. This pure knowing is immediately a being for another. For a pure self-identity, it is immediacy or being, but this being is at the same time the pure universal, the selfhood of all. In other words, the action is acknowledged and therefore actual. This being is the element whereby conscience stands directly in a relation of equality with every self-consciousness, and the meaning of this relation is not an impersonal law, but the self of conscience. However, in that this right thing which conscience does is at the same time a being for another, it seems that a disparity attaches to consciousness. The duty which it fulfills is a specific content. It is true that this content is the self of consciousness, and so consciousness's knowledge of itself, its identity with itself. But once fulfilled, set in the medium of being, this identity is no longer knowing, no longer this process of differentiation, in which the differences are at the same time immediately superseded. On the contrary, in being, the difference is established as an enduring difference, and the action is a specific action, and identical with the element of everyone's self-consciousness, and therefore not necessarily acknowledged. Both sides, the consciousness that acts and the universal consciousness that acknowledges action as duty, are equally free from the specificity of this action. On account of this freedom, their relationship in the common medium of their connection is really a relation of complete disparity, as a result of which the consciousness, which is explicitly aware of the action, finds itself in a state of complete uncertainty about the spirit which does the action and is certain of itself. The latter acts, it gives being to a specific content. Others hold to this being as the spirit's truth and are therein certain of the spirit. It has declared therein what it holds to be duty, but it is free from any specific duty. It is not present at that point where others imagine it actually to be, and this very medium of being and duty as something possessing intrinsic being count for it only as a moment. What therefore it places before them, it also displaces again, or rather has straightway displaced or dissembled, for its actual being is for it not this duty and determinate character it has put forward, but the actuality which it has in the absolute certainty of itself. Others, therefore, do not know whether this conscience is merely morally good or evil, or rather they not only cannot know, but they must also take it to be evil. For just as it is free from the specificity of duty, and from duty as possessing an intrinsic being, so likewise are they. What conscience places before them, they themselves know how to displace or dissemble. It is something expressing only the self of another, not their own self. Not only do they know themselves to be free from it, but they must dispose of it in their own consciousness, nullify it by judging and explaining it in order to preserve their own self. But the action of conscience is not only this determination of being, which is forsaken by the pure self. What is to be valid and to be recognized as duty is so only through the knowledge and conviction that it is duty. Through the knowledge of oneself in the deed, if the deed ceases to have the self within it, it ceases to be that which alone is its essence. Its existence forsaken by this consciousness would be an ordinary reality, and the action would appear to us to be the fulfilling of one's pleasure and desire. What ought to be there is an essentiality solely by its being known to be the self-expression of an individuality, and it is this being known that is acknowledged by others, and which as such ought to have an existence. Two ladies reading. It's a painting by Clara. That might be Clara there on the right, actually. Looks like her. I don't know who the other lady is, though. Anyway, just one more video to go, and then we are finished with the longest section in the Phenomenology. which is that of spirit.